It started as one of those mornings that feels almost too peaceful to trust. The kind where everything seems to go right for once. The coffee machine didn't overflow, traffic was lighter than usual, and I managed to leave work earlier than expected. For the first time all week, I was going to get home while the sun was still up. That small victory was enough to put me in a good mood that I lived in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac where every home looked like it had been copied and pasted from the same template. Identical mailboxes, uniform lawns, and a homeowners association that took aesthetic consistency a little too seriously. But the one thing that wasn't shared, ironically enough, was parking. Every homeowner had one assigned space just in front of their house, clearly numbered and recorded in the HOA registry. It wasn't complicated. Every resident knew the rules. Your space, your car, no exceptions that I'd been parking in spot number 14 since I moved in. It was mine, painted, documented, and even written into my homeowner contract. The spot wasn't particularly special, but after dealing with HOA fines and neighbor complaints for nearly 2 years, it had become sacred ground when I turned onto my street that evening, expecting to see my driveway clear and ready for me. The last thing I expected was a shiny white SUV sitting directly in the middle of my spot. At first, I thought it might have been a visitor. Maybe someone got confused or a delivery driver parked temporarily. But when I got closer, I saw a custom license plate frame that read #MomLifeQueen, a bright pink baby on board decal on the back window, and a matching vanity plate cover that screamed entitlement from 50 feet away. That's when I realized exactly whose car it was. Karen. She'd moved into the cul-de-sac 2 months earlier, into the corner house that had been vacant for almost a year. Within days, everyone knew her name, not because she introduced herself, but because she had already filed 3 complaints with the HOA. First, about someone's trash cans being left out too long. Then, about a barking dog she claimed was keeping her baby up at night. The third complaint had been about me, specifically that my outdoor lights were too bright and distracting drivers. From the moment she arrived, it was clear that Karen saw the neighborhood as her personal kingdom. She wasn't technically on the HOA board, but she behaved like she ran it. She was always walking around with a clipboard, jotting notes about people's lawns, decorations, or the condition of their fences. It wasn't long before her nickname among residents became Clipboard Karen. Seeing her SUV in my spot sent a wave of irritation through me. It wasn't just disrespect, it was defiance. She knew exactly what she was doing. My spot was clearly marked, with my house number printed in bold white paint right in front of it. There was no way she could have mistaken it for her own. I parked temporarily at the curb and stared at the vehicle, trying to keep calm. I reminded myself that it was just a parking spot. It wasn't worth a confrontation. But then I noticed something small that pushed me over the edge. A folded piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. It wasn't a note from someone else. It was mine. I recognized the bright yellow paper immediately. It was an HOA warning slip, the kind issued for rule violations. The irony hit me instantly. She had actually taken one of the spare HOA slips, available to all members for reporting issues, and left it on my car earlier in the week because of grass height inconsistency. Now her own SUV sat illegally in my designated space, as if she owned the street that I didn't need to guess what she'd say if I confronted her. She'd probably claim it was an emergency, or that there was no other parking available. But the cul-de-sac was half empty. There were at least 3 open guest spots less than 30 feet away. No, this wasn't about convenience. This was a message, a show of power. Instead of reacting, I took a photo, then another, then several more from different angles. I captured the license plate, the painted number on the asphalt, and even a few wide shots showing the open guest spots nearby. Evidence mattered here, especially with someone like Karen. Then I opened my HOA handbook. There it was, under Parking Regulations, Section 5.2. Assigned spaces are the exclusive right of the resident listed on file. Unauthorized vehicles may be towed at the discretion of the homeowner, provided proper documentation is recorded. That was all I needed to read. I'd never used the clause before, but I knew exactly how to handle it. The HOA had a preferred towing company listed in the handbook, and their number was saved in my phone for emergencies. I dialed without hesitation. When the dispatcher picked up, I explained the situation calmly. They confirmed the address, my name, and the assigned space number. Then they asked for the vehicle details. I gave them everything: make, model, plate number, color. The dispatcher paused briefly, then told me a tow truck would arrive within 20 minutes. That I waited from my front porch, sipping the remainder of my coffee as dusk settled over the neighborhood. It felt oddly satisfying, not out of spite, but out of justice. For once, the rules were on my side, and I intended to use them exactly as written. 15 minutes later, I heard the low rumble of a diesel engine approaching. The tow truck turned the corner slowly, its yellow lights flickering across the street. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, and glanced toward the white SUV. He didn't need an explanation. One look at the painted numbers beneath the vehicle, and he nodded in understanding. He hooked the SUV up efficiently, without drama or hesitation. I stayed on my porch the entire time, silent and composed. It took less than 10 minutes before the vehicle was tilted onto the flatbed, secured, and ready to leave. As the truck pulled away, I couldn't help but notice a curtain twitch from across the street, Karen's window. She was home, watching. For a brief second, our eyes met through the dim light of her living room. Even from that distance, I could feel her outrage. She vanished from the window almost immediately. I knew what was coming next. There would be yelling, complaints, maybe even a visit from the HOA president himself. Karen wasn't the type to take humiliation quietly, and in her mind, getting her car towed would be nothing short of an act of war. But for the first time since she moved in, I didn't care. The rules were clear, the evidence was solid, and I'd acted completely within my rights. As night settled over the cul-de-sac, the neighborhood was quiet again. Peaceful, almost the way it used to be before Karen arrived. But I knew that silence wouldn't last, because Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She'd make this personal. She'd make sure everyone in the HOA knew her version of the story. And as much as I wanted to believe the problem was solved, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning began with the sound of shouting. It wasn't the typical morning noise of kids heading to school or dogs barking. It was sharper, louder, filled with the kind of rage that could only belong to one person. Karen, by the time I stepped outside, she was already pacing back and forth in her driveway, phone in hand, waving a piece of paper like it was a court order. Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac, loud enough for everyone to hear. Though I couldn't make out every word, I didn't have to. The tone said everything. She was furious. Her SUV was gone, towed away into the night, and now she was determined to make me the villain. She pointed toward my house repeatedly, gesturing in exaggerated anger, likely telling anyone who would listen that I had illegally taken her vehicle. A couple of neighbors lingered on their lawns, pretending to tidy up just to catch the spectacle. The HOA president, an older man named Frank, arrived within half an hour. He was calm, diplomatic, and far too patient for someone who had to deal with people like her daily. From the corner of my window, I watched him try to reason with her, flipping through papers from his binder. I could tell he was explaining the parking regulations, rules she had either ignored or deliberately violated. Karen didn't want logic. She wanted control. Her arms flailed as she spoke, pacing the pavement like a general rallying her troops. Eventually, she pointed at my house again, and Frank gave me that apologetic look of a man caught in the middle of a feud he wanted no part of. I stepped outside just as he was walking up my driveway. His voice was low and careful. He told me Karen had filed a formal grievance against me for unauthorized towing, claiming she didn't know the spot was assigned. But when I showed him the time-stamped photos and cited the exact HOA section number, he sighed deeply and said there was nothing more to discuss. The rules were clear. The space was mine. The tow was valid. Still, Karen wasn't done. Later that day, she started her next campaign, one that relied not on rules, but on annoyance. It began subtly. Trash from her bins accidentally blew across my lawn. Sprinklers mysteriously oversprayed onto my driveway, soaking my walkway and leaving puddles overnight. Her friends, or maybe visiting relatives, began parking their cars as close to my curb as possible, making it difficult for me to maneuver into my driveway. It wasn't vandalism, just petty inconvenience. The kind that couldn't be easily proven but was always perfectly timed. I told myself to ignore it. The moment I reacted, she'd win. People like Karen thrived on attention, and silence was their biggest frustration. So I focused on keeping my property clean, my car parked properly, and my interactions minimal. But even that wasn't enough. Within a week, she escalated. One evening, I returned home to find a bright yellow envelope taped to my door, a notice of HOA violation. I frowned, tearing it open immediately. The accusation? Excessive noise from power tools after restricted hours. Except I hadn't used any power tools. Not that week. Not even that month. I called Frank, who sounded genuinely confused. According to him, Karen had filed a written report claiming she had recordings of the disturbance. When pressed, she hadn't produced them. Still, the HOA had to process complaints, which meant I now had to either pay a small fine or appeal the claim. I chose to appeal. The next HOA meeting was held 3 days later in the community hall, a neutral space where disputes like this were supposed to be settled civilly. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, and the dozen or so residents who showed up wore the same tired expressions. People who just wanted their homes to stay peaceful, but knew that wasn't going to happen. Karen arrived fashionably late, carrying her usual clipboard and a stack of printed documents that looked official but were clearly just self-made. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, claiming that I was creating a hostile environment, that I'd targeted her unfairly, and that my vindictive behavior was driving away potential homebuyers. That IT was a performance, one filled with dramatic sighs and carefully chosen words. When it was my turn, I simply placed the HOA handbook on the table, flipped to the relevant section, and presented the photos I'd taken the night of the towing. I explained the timeline, the documentation, and even showed the confirmation from the towing company that the vehicle had been removed lawfully. Then I read the HOA clause aloud, just as I had before. The room went quiet. Even Frank nodded slowly, acknowledging that everything I'd done was within my rights. The board voted unanimously to dismiss Karen's grievance and void her noise complaint entirely. For a moment, it felt like victory, but Karen wasn't humiliated easily. As I packed up my things to leave, I noticed the look on her face. She wasn't defeated, she was plotting. Over the next week, she changed tactics again. This time, she played the victim publicly. She began chatting with neighbors on evening walks, spinning her version of events, that she was new, that she didn't understand the parking system, and that I'd had her car towed without warning. She framed herself as the poor, misunderstood single mother just trying to raise her child in a judgmental neighborhood. My frustration, it worked, at least a little. Some neighbors started avoiding eye contact when I waved. A few even stopped chatting with me altogether. Karen had managed to twist a straightforward incident into a story of neighborhood cruelty. Then came the final blow of that week, a post on the local community Facebook group. Karen had written a long, emotional paragraph about toxic neighbors and abuse of power, carefully leaving out names, but dropping enough hints that everyone knew exactly who she meant. The comments section exploded with sympathy from people outside the neighborhood who didn't know the full story. That I wanted to respond. Every word of me wanted to correct the record, to defend myself, to expose her manipulations. But I didn't. Because as I scrolled through the thread, something caught my eye. A comment from someone I hadn't seen in months. To IT was Mark, the local tow truck driver who'd handled the SUV that night. He'd seen the post, recognized her story, and simply replied, "Funny, that same victim threatened to call the cops on me when I showed up to remove her car from a marked private space. Still got the dashcam footage." The tone of the thread changed instantly. Suddenly, sympathy turned to curiosity. People started asking questions. Karen stopped replying. Within an hour, she deleted the post entirely. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of peace. Maybe, I thought, this was finally over. Maybe the truth had found its way through all the noise. But late that night, as I took out my trash, I saw something that made my stomach sink. A piece of paper taped to my front door again. Only this time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, bold, and angry. "You'll regret this." The words were underlined twice, and in that moment, I realized Karen wasn't done. Not even close. The note on my door wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. The kind that seeps into your mind and lingers, making every sound in the night feel suspicious. For the next few days, I kept my porch light on later than usual. I double-checked the locks before going to bed. Every time I heard a noise outside, I found myself peeking through the blinds, half expecting to see Karen standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, that smug expression twisting into something darker. But the night stayed quiet. Almost too quiet. And that silence was worse than any confrontation. It meant she was planning something. By the end of the week, I finally saw what it was. Saturday morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and froze. My car was covered in sticky, pale streaks that glistened under the sun. It took a second to process, but then the smell hit me. Raw eggs. Dozens of them, dried overnight and baked into the paint by the morning heat. That IT wasn't kids. The angles were too deliberate, the splatters too concentrated. Whoever had done it wanted to send a message. And I didn't need to guess who that someone was. Still, I refused to act without proof. I'd learned by now that Karen's favorite weapon was manipulation. If I confronted her without evidence, she'd twist it into another harassment claim. So instead, I cleaned the car quietly, installed a motion-activated security camera above my garage, and waited. 2 nights later, around 11:45 p.m., that patience finally paid off. The camera pinged an alert to my phone. A small motion detected near the driveway. I opened the app instantly, and there she was. Karen, wearing a hoodie, glancing around like a thief, holding something in her hand. It looked like a can of spray paint. She moved toward the curb, crouched down, and began painting over the number of my parking spot. My number. She was actually trying to cover the marking to make it look unassigned. I watched her for several seconds in disbelief. It wasn't just petty anymore, it was sabotage. When she finished, she stepped back to admire her work, then turned and strutted away like she'd done something clever. I downloaded the footage immediately, time-stamped and crystal clear. And as I sat there, staring at the frozen frame of her mid-stride, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. First, to the HOA president, Frank. I told him what had happened, then sent the footage. He didn't even try to hide his exasperation. Karen had officially gone too far. Second, I called the local police department. Property defacement, even minor, still counted as vandalism. The officer I spoke to took it seriously and said he'd send someone by that afternoon to take a report. And finally, the third call, ironically, to the same towing company as before. Not for her car this time, but because the HOA requested that they inspect and repaint the space number properly, restoring the marking to its original condition. By lunchtime, everything was in motion. The officer arrived, reviewed the footage, and confirmed there was more than enough evidence to press charges. He even recognized her from a previous neighborhood dispute report filed months ago. He took my statement, snapped a few photos, and promised to follow up once they contacted her. Meanwhile, word began to spread through the neighborhood. Frank had forwarded the footage to the HOA board, who decided to call an emergency meeting that very evening. It wasn't public at first, but Karen must have found out, because by 6 p.m., she was standing at the community hall doors, arms crossed, waiting for everyone to arrive. The tension inside was electric. Residents sat in folding chairs, murmuring quietly as Frank played the footage from my camera on a small projector screen. There was no mistaking it. Karen's face, her movements, the act itself. Her attempt to erase the number was visible in perfect clarity. For once, Karen didn't have a speech ready. She stood frozen, her usual confidence crumbling as people turned toward her with shock and disgust. She tried to speak, something about editing and misunderstandings, but the evidence was undeniable. The HOA board didn't hesitate. Within minutes, they voted unanimously to fine her for vandalism, issue a formal warning, and revoke her access to the HOA's community privileges for 6 months. Frank also confirmed that the HOA would cooperate fully with the police investigation. As the meeting ended, Karen bolted out of the room, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Her reputation, the one she'd worked so hard to maintain through manipulation and lies, had collapsed completely. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, a tow truck rolled back into the cul-de-sac. But this time, it wasn't for my car or even for a parking violation. It was for Karen's. She'd ignored the fines, the citations, and the police warnings about her behavior. Her registration had expired, and the vehicle had been parked illegally for days. The same driver as before stepped out, hooked up her SUV, and towed it away once again, right in front of everyone. A few neighbors stood outside to watch, shaking their heads in disbelief. By the time the truck turned the corner, Karen's house looked darker than ever. Curtains closed, blinds drawn, no sign of the once proud woman who used to march up and down the street with her clipboard and superiority. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn not long after. She moved out quietly, no goodbyes, no posts, no drama. Just gone. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood felt different. Peaceful again. Kids played in the cul-de-sac without her shouting at them for being too loud. Trash bins stayed where they belonged. And for once, HOA meetings didn't feel like courtroom battles. That MY parking spot, freshly repainted and gleaming under the sun, became something of a running joke among the neighbors. They'd smile and say, "That's the most famous spot on the street." But beneath the humor, I knew there was a lesson in all of it. People like Karen thrive on control. They build their power not through strength or authority, but through intimidation and the illusion that everyone else will back down. The moment you stop letting them control the narrative, their power crumbles. I never wanted revenge. I just wanted peace. But sometimes, the only way to protect your peace is to stand your ground and let the truth and the tow truck do the heavy lifting. Months later, a new family moved into Karen's old house. They introduced themselves warmly, hosted a small block party, and laughed when I pointed out my freshly painted number on the pavement. They said they'd heard something about the previous owner, but didn't ask for details. I told them only one thing: just don't park in spot 14. And with that, the cul-de-sac was finally quiet again.